It is the one drug that you see it in the business community. You see it in the part of society that people don't think there's drugs in, right? Of course, the meth's out there and the heroin and the other drugs as well. But the Wall Street guy's not going to talk about shooting up meth, right? But he might talk about snorting a line of coke, right? He would just have lines of people just standing in line. This wasn't behind the building. This was, and they would just when their time's up, they'd pull their cash out and they'd get drugs and walk away. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Yeah, I actually stood in one of those lines and bought some dope.
Hey, Brian Townsend, welcome back to Tales from the Shift.
Hey, thank you for the opportunity. Look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, right on. So we had you on here before. You had a lot of stories, and it felt like you had a lot more to talk about. So that's why I wanted to bring you back and sort of expand on some of the stuff that barely got touched on, and then maybe we'll even talk about some things that weren't even mentioned the first time. So you had started talking about the Wire television show the first time, and how somehow you're involved with the whole thing. Why don't you just tee it up for us?
Yeah, that was a fun case, but I want to make it clear it wasn't the actual actors on The Wire or anyone involved in the show. It was just there was a lot of parallels, and our main trafficker was a super fan, if you will, and he was actually a lot of these actors that were on the show were kind of up and coming actors, right? They didn't really have names and or established careers in Hollywood yet, and so they were more accessible, and he would pay them to come into nightclubs in the Baltimore area and sign autographs and shake hands and things like that. And unbeknownst to them, at least I believe unbeknownst to them, he was a drug trafficker, a pretty large scale drug trafficker, and he was just using his money and to you know to have access to these up and coming stars. But so we had an investigation. It actually started in Arkansas by a really aggressive, great trooper who made a vehicle stop and seized just under $1 million cash. And at that time, we were working with the Arkansas State Police, investigating all their drug seizures and money seizures on the highway. And I was up. It was my turn to respond, and he called, said he had a cash seizure. Immediately went out there, and we just we helped with we're the investigative arm, if you will. They did the initial the hard work, and then we come in and try to put all the pieces of the puzzle together, and end up linking it to a pretty large organization out of Arizona that was bringing primarily cocaine, but also marijuana into the United States, into Arizona, and then from there it would get transported primarily to the East Coast. So not just Baltimore, Maryland, but Virginia, West Virginia. I mean, really up and down from New York, almost, I wouldn't say Florida, but maybe the Carolinas up to closer to New York. I mean, they're just flooding that area with both cocaine and marijuana, and the money seizure that the trooper got was actually proceeds. It was drug proceeds that were returning back to Arizona when the vehicle was stopped. But again, it led into this large conspiracy investigation. Took a couple years to investigate, multi-jurisdictional. Worked with offices from Los Angeles to Richmond, Virginia, so coast to coast, and ultimately we saw several indictments and several spin-off cases in several jurisdictions, resulting in more arrests and more seizures. So happy to dive deeper in it, but that's kind of the nutshell.
Big picture. So, okay. So I'm trying to picture this. So physically, did you end up in the Baltimore area then?
Yeah, we were working with DEA counterparts and also local counterparts, law enforcement in those areas. So yeah, we were able to identify some co-conspirators in their area, who were involved in accepting these large loads and then further trafficking or distribution, if you will. So yeah, we physically went to those locations. We interviewed people, we arrested people, we worked those operations. When I'm traveling like that, it's I'm kind of a guest, if you will. I know I have federal jurisdiction, but I'm working with them and their investigations as well. And it's all parallel investigations. We're all trying to do help each other and ultimately put the bad people in jail.
So when you say you have federal jurisdiction, but at the same time, it wasn't your area. Are you saying you're with DEA agents that it is their area, or are you saying you're with a different agency?
A little of both. So, I
Okay.
mean, so when you're assigned to a DA office, let's say you're in Baltimore, you have an area of responsibility, and let's just say it's only Baltimore. Yeah, your investigation is probably going to take you to other places, and you can go those other places, but you're going to coordinate with those offices. So if I'm in Little Rock, Arkansas at the time, and I'm working with my DEA counterparts in the Baltimore area. Yeah, my jurisdiction allows me to work out there and talk to people, arrest people, etc. But I have to coordinate with them on it's ultimately their backyard, right? And it's a courtesy thing. It's just it's a policy thing. And then when it's state and local, we want to be careful as well, and we don't want to have that reputation of just coming in saying, "Hey, we're taking this over," and you know, uh, 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 you know, thank you, right? Uh, we want to work with them. We want to work with their investigators, their folks, and we need them quite simply. They offer a perspective and they offer resources that sometimes we don't have. Like we don't have patrol cars, right? We don't have canines. What if I need a vehicle stopped? Plus, it's just the right thing to do. If some officer's working a case and uh, we want to offer our help, our assistance, our resources, and make the case better. Say better, more federal prosecution. How's that?
Right, right. Yeah.
Hopefully better
Interesting.
for everybody.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, that goes against what I think a lot of people have seen on television, where it's like the the feds show up. This is ours now. You can, Barney Fife. You can step aside or whatever.
Yeah, with drug cases, it is a little bit different. I mean, I'm not saying that we can't go in and intentionally do that, but it just we pride ourselves at DEA having a really just remarkable relationship with state and federal. I'm sorry, other federal, state, and local law enforcement. And I know in the movies, it's the FBI. We're here to help. Thank you. and
Yeah.
and maybe if it's a bank robbery or something with federal jurisdiction, it does make sense for them sometimes to take the investigation over. But DA is a lot different, and that's one thing. I mean, I know I'm biased because was DEA, but we truly do have an amazing relationship. You go into any DEA office in the United States, and you're going to find a lot of local law enforcement represented in that office. I mean, my last assignment at DEA, I was in Springfield, Missouri, where I was in charge, and I don't know, 90% of our office was state and local officers who are deputized that are on our task force. And that's the bread and butter of what a typical DA office is. I mean, we really are ingrained in our communities, and I love that. And not that every single office is all peaches and flowers. Is that a description? But sometimes there's issues here and there, but we really pride ourselves on making those relationships work.
Yeah. Having trouble picturing what you're talking about there. So you say someone is deputized, but they're in your office, but they're also a local police. Like, they're being paid by the local department and they're spending extra time helping DA? Is it
Yeah, yeah. So their salary is going to be paid by their parent agency. So let's say it's I don't know, Chicago PD, right? They are Baltimore PD. We're talking about Baltimore. They come in and Baltimore PD. They're still employed by Baltimore PD. They still have the Baltimore PD badge in salary, but we will assist financially. We'll pay overtime, and in some offices, in this, there are other budgets where we can help pay for cell phones or gas or vehicles and things like that. And then we deputize them. We actually give them a DEA badge. It's silver. It's not gold like the agents get from graduating basic agent school. But now it gives them the ability to further their investigations outside of their jurisdiction. So if it's Baltimore PD and they're a task force officer, and let's say in that particular investigation, we had ties to Los Angeles. None of those guys from Baltimore went to LA with me, but they could have. They had that authority when they're deputized.
best? I would imagine it looks good on their resume too.
Yeah, right. I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's all about perspective, right? And so now you're in investigations and you've been assigned, let's say, frauds, and now you're working in drugs, and then you've been assigned to a DEA task force or maybe an FBI or HSI task force. I mean, you're broadening your perspective. You're getting more nuggets and more knowledge, and hopefully that helps you, and hopefully it helps your department, in all uh, facets of your career.
So out there in Baltimore, I don't know how much you can expand on this. It sounds like you're being a little coy there for a minute. Like, what actually happened? So you're there in Baltimore. What happens?
Actually, my I'm not trying to be secretive. A lot of what I was doing was interviews. A lot of these folks were we either they were either arrested and we were approaching them to see if they'd cooperate, or we were cold approaching them, meaning that we would literally just either knock on a door or try to set up an interview where we just came in and sat down and showed my badge, told them who I was, and says, "This is what I'm doing. I'm investigating this criminal activity, and it spans multiple states. A lot of folks involved. You've been you've been identified. This is what we believe you're doing. You can roll the dice and take your chances, and maybe you're a defendant in this case, and or maybe we don't go after you, and maybe maybe everything's okay. But we'd rather you cooperate and tell us what you know, and avoid possible federal prosecution and do the right thing." So that's what a lot of what I was doing, really. I mean, in this particular investigation, a lot of my travel was just trying to put pieces together. I mean, we were trying to prove a historical conspiracy investigation. So we had two or more people involved in a criminal activity. So it's the best example I can give you is think bank robbery, right? Like, just say you and I decide to rob a bank. You go in and rob the bank, and I stay out and have the car, the getaway car. And even if you're inside and you end up shooting somebody, I'm still responsible. I was still part of this criminal activity, right? And within the drug realm, I mean, okay, you may have been the one who sold the dope, but maybe I'm the one who gave it to you. Maybe I'm the one who transported it. Maybe I'm the one who made it. We're trying to put all these people into one organization and hold them all accountable, right? And that's something that I was doing this particular investigation. That's one of the reasons I was traveling so much and working with other agencies, is because I was collaborating evidence. I was looking for potential defendants or potential witnesses. I was trying to establish people, get them on board, maybe even make them in confidential informants where they could do something more proactive or I'm sorry, more, proactive as opposed to, reactive.
Oh, wow, there's so many questions to ask. So confidential informant, so a CI. Uh,
Yeah.
why would someone want to do that? Is it because you have something held over them, or or do they get paid sometimes, or how does that play?
Yeah, one thing I always tell, especially young people, or when I'm teaching this class on confidential informants, is I always tell the investigator, figure out the motivation, always. And the majority of time, it's judicial consideration. I want to stay out of jail. I've been caught with X, and I know that I'm exposed to some jail time. Therefore, I'm going to cooperate, tell them whatever they need to know, so I can not get my butt in jail, right? That's absolutely the biggest reason why people cooperate, judicial consideration. But there are other motivations. There are professional informants. We call them mercenaries sometimes, who will literally shop around cases. They'll go to the police department and say, "Hey, I can, this Shane guy is a drug trafficker, and I can make purchases from him. And how much you going to pay me?" Right? And they might even wait till I hear your answer, and then they go to another department and see if they can get a higher amount, and try to play these games like that. But these are folks that are just literally professional informants who just work for law enforcement, in that capacity. We have competition sometimes, and of course they'll lie about their motivation. They're not going to come in and say, "Hey, I'm the biggest trafficker in town, but Shane's, he's pushing on my territory, so I'm going to give you all the information I can on him so you can arrest him, and then I can take over." They're not going to tell you that. They're going to say something like, "This guy Shane, he's killing our community, and I care about our community." So they're gonna act, like they're doing the right thing. And ultimately, they just want to remove you as competition. There's wannabe cops. There's people out there who want to be involved in the law enforcement community, for whatever reason can't, and they want to be around cops. So they figured, hey, if I'm an informant, that's my way of getting in, right? So you got to figure out the motivation. But number one, by far, is stay out of jail.
Oh, so it was that pretty common that someone would try to inform on a competitor?
Yeah, you know what? More so than you'd think. And that's a struggle because, like I said, we always have to figure out what their motivation is. And in fact, at DEA, that was a question that you would ask yourself. And if you didn't, your supervisor was supposed to ask you, why is this person cooperating? Why is this person offering to provide assistance? So you have to answer that to the best of your ability, right? And like I said, most of the time it's he got arrested. He wants to stay out of jail. But when there is no arrest involved, you have to dive a little deeper. You have to, do your due diligence. What is it about this guy? Do we have any other intel on this guy? You're definitely going to have to figure it out. And but yeah, it happens. Absolutely happens. And when we figure that out, things change. We're no longer friendly towards these people, right? We now build cases against them.
So someone comes along, you realize their motivation is that they have a competitor, and then you realize they're also a drug dealer. So do you just move on both of them then? Like you still, I mean, you've gotten the information, so use why not take out their competitor while also going in the other direction too? I mean, you tell me.
No, we'll make the competitor bigger. No, I'm just kidding. No, we don't do that at all. Just no, no. We will, like you said, we're going to take them both out. That's that intel we got. We're going to consider that free intel, and we're gonna leverage it at the best of our ability. Right? We're gonna see if there's other agencies that have investigations or other informants that can help us. Yeah, we're gonna 100% uh, use that and hopefully target them and you know hold them accountable for anything they're doing illegally as well.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just wrap up the whole wire story. So you went to Baltimore. I'm assuming it was whoever was convicted, this trafficker, and it was handled.
Yeah, yeah. The main one we wanted was actually it was a bus that was stopped in Arkansas, and the bus, it was a tour bus, so it had the tinted windows and the whole 9 yards. And there were, I forget now, 4 or 5 individuals on the bus, and they were all sleeping. Um, the bus driver, race got involved, which was interesting as well. The bus driver was white, and all the occupants were black. It was a tour bus, so all the windows were dark, couldn't see in. And even if you could see in, they were all sleeping, so they were literally underneath the window. But somehow or another, this bus got stopped because they were black, and of course that wasn't the case. So they tried to make it, it's Arkansas, racist, blah blah blah, and it just got really ugly. There was some politics involved. Somebody who was tied to a politician, so he started doing some inquiries, and it was an easy one. It was a slam dunk. I mean, any reasonable person could look at one paragraph of the investigation, realize that there's a lot of smoke, and there is no fire. And it was a way for, in fact, it was like, we'll stop doing this if you drop the case and you give the money back. Like, what? Like, you're not going to hold us hostage with this stuff. And it just got really ugly. But in the same time, as we were starting to do our investigation, we realized that this main guy who's kind of pushing that false narrative out there is a big time drug trafficker. I mean, moving kilos and kilos of cocaine and pounds of marijuana into Nogales, uh, to Arizona from the border there, and then, like I said, shipping them out east for distribution. And we were able to put, I mean, just a lot of weight on this guy. Prove that he was distributing a ton of dope. And ultimately, I think the funnest part of the investigation is when uh, I flew out to Arizona, the Phoenix area, and he had a couple houses out there, and we got to execute multiple search warrants and put him in handcuffs, and then all of a sudden, all the politicians and everyone else they had nothing more to say because this was a bad guy who was you know now being held accountable for what he was doing.
I've personally never had cocaine. I don't even think I've ever seen it in real life. Um, but it was funny. I was talking to someone recently, and they told me that a lot more people do cocaine than you think. And I was like, really? And he goes, and I go, do you do cocaine? He said, no, no, not me. He said, but I know a lot of people. And I'm going, wow, that's like, I feel like there's this shadow world around me, of a lot of cocaine usage and other drugs, I'm sure too. But it really surprised me. He said,
Yeah.
he said, if you use, then, like, people, like you can sniff it out as a metaphor, but you know what I mean?
That's a good metaphor. I like that.
Yeah.
Uh, it is the one drug that, other than marijuana, that, it's you see it in the business community, you see it, in the part of in the part of society that people don't think there's drugs in, right? And you don't see of course, the meth's out there and the heroin and the other drugs as well, but the Wall Street guy's not going to talk about shooting up meth, right? But he might talk about snorting a line of coke, right? Even Hollywood, look at Hollywood, right? When they glamorize drug use, it's what is it? It's if it's not marijuana, it's always snorting coke.
Yeah.
You never
Yeah.
see him shooting heroin or
Yeah.
taking
I
fentanyl.
think the only time I've seen it in a movie was probably, what the heck was the name? Anyway, the only time I've ever seen heroin use in a movie, it was in a negative light. So it wasn't
Yeah,
that they didn't show it in a positive way. So,
it's not as sexy, right? And neither is meth.
yeah.
Cocaine, they unfortunately show it in a sexy light, which is very misleading. And
Did you see that a lot where someone, ended up getting involved deeply in cocaine and it started innocently enough, and next thing you know, their life just kinda goes and it sort of spirals along and
I've certainly spoken to people. I remember not too long ago, I was doing a presentation on fentanyl, and I had a lady come up to me and talked about her cocaine use and how she's thankful that when she stopped using cocaine and got into treatment, that was before fentanyl hit the scene, right? And because she says I'd probably be dead now, and I've had other folks, especially a lot of folks who use heroin, tell me the same thing, and I asked her about her history with it, and she said she was a teenager and just thought it was a cool thing to do. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure I can think of some other examples, but yeah, I mean, it's some of that is that popular culture, right? They see people smoke weed or snort coke in the movies and or on in music and things like that, and they think there's something sexy about it, and there's nothing cool or sexy about it at all. And so,
Pulp Fiction.
Pulp Fiction, great movie. Gosh,
I don't know why it took me so long.
yeah, with John Travolta and
Yeah.
Samuel. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, and I think it was
good
Uma
movie.
Thurman that had the issue
Yeah,
with the
that was heroin, right?
heroin. Yeah.
Yeah, because I don't know if it was Narcan he used. I forget now. I have to go back and watch that. Huh.
Yeah, well, they no, it was adrenaline?
It was adrenaline, yeah,
Adrenaline
and it
shot,
was
yeah.
mistake because later on, that's right, it was. Some people thought it was naloxone, which is Narcan, but yeah, it was. You're right, it was adrenaline. Yeah,
Alright.
yeah,
Well, hey, so this is probably a good segue, so why don't you give us the current situation on fentanyl? I know you talked about it before.
yeah.
Where are we at in the country now? What's happening?
I personally think we're still in crisis mode. I mean, the numbers have dropped quite a bit over the last couple of years. In 2023, we lost 105,000 Americans. 2024, we lost about 80,000 Americans to drugs, not just fentanyl. We don't know 2025 numbers yet, but I suspect it's going to be around the same. Again, I don't know that for sure yet, but just some preliminary data I've seen. And then more importantly, though, when you dive into those numbers, it's about 70 to 75% are dying because of fentanyl. So you take out one drug, fentanyl, then our numbers are low. And I'm not minimizing their lives. One is too many, but um, we're like I say, we're at 80 to 100,000 people dying every year still because of uh, primarily because of one drug. It's everywhere. I mean, it's saturated our heroin supply. If you can find heroin, good luck, or congrats. And there are pockets, Chicago, New York, New York. I know that sounds crazy, right? Congrats, you found heroin. I see you laughing there. Uh,
Well, why do you say that? Why do you say that it's hard to get heroin? Is you saying fentanyl's just replaced it, like people are choosing that, so supply and demand kind of a situation?
Absolutely. So if I'm a drug trafficker, um, there's two processes. If I'm going to make heroin, I have to have a poppy plant. So the poppy plant, I'm going to need the plant, right? So I'm going to need soil, I'm going to need water, I'm going to need the sun, and I'm going to need time. So let's say 3 or so months after I plant that seed and I get this beautiful plant and the flowers drop and I get these little pods. From that pod, I get raw opium. And from raw opium, I get morphine, which is a very easy process. I mean, the idiot Taliban does it all the time, and it's very easy process. And then from there, though, then I have to have some type of chemical synthesis to get to heroin. It's not difficult, but you can see where I'm going, right? I'm
Yeah.
soil, sun, water, time,
Yep.
blah blah blah. With fentanyl, it's just synthetic. It's completely man-made. All I need to do is mix chemicals together. Yeah, there's some time involved, for the chemicals to process and do that, but it's cheaper and it's easier. So if you go back and you look how fentanyl got into our drug supply, ultimately it got in through heroin. we had an uptick in heroin because of prescription pills, and most people who use heroin start with legal prescription pills, opioids. About 75%, 80% of all heroin users start with legal opioid prescriptions. So when that happened in the mid 1990s, and we saw an uptake in opioids and heroin use, the traffickers, they couldn't make this stuff fast enough. So they introduced fentanyl into it because, just like heroin, fentanyl is an opioid. It's much stronger opioid, but it's an opioid. So it was the perfect cut, highly addictive, cheap, and then it just ultimately just, I say, took over. I mean, it really did. I mean, if you look at the seizures, and this is something I talk about a lot, where I show the numbers. I mean, our heroin seizures in the United States have dropped substantially over the last, let's say 10 years now. I mean, substantially. But and then the same time, our fentanyl seizures have increased substantially. One of the systems, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, so I did, please stop me, but one of the systems that I track is called the National Forensic Laboratory Information System, NFLIS, because there has to be an acronym because the government's involved, right? And the DEA runs this program, and they work with about 98 to 99% of all the drug labs in the United States. So I don't care if you're with your local police department, your sheriff's office, or HSI, FBI, whoever, your lab who you send your drug evidence to is probably participating in this program. And when I was looking at the data, I was blown away. In 2014, there were about 5,500 fentanyl exhibits seized by law enforcement. By 2019, it was over 100,000. By 2020, it was over 200,000. So in a very short time period, we went from, I don't say barely seeing it, because we were definitely seeing more and more of it, to just absolutely taking over, right? And historically, meth has been the number one drug seized, and it still is. Cocaine has been number two, but now fentanyl is the second most seized drug. So again, it came on the market via heroin. It just took over. So that's why I say that. I mean, it's very difficult to find pure heroin. If you do find heroin, or someone representing a product as heroin, there's about a 75% chance that it's going to contain some fentanyl. So if you have a drug trafficker, and we've had informants, and we still talk to law enforcement, narcotics, and DEA, who say this, like they're actually looking for heroin and they can't find it. But if you do find a trafficker who says, "Yeah, come to me, I got heroin," more than likely it's either fentanyl or it's heavily mixed with fentanyl. And then from there, it went into our pills, it went into our cocaine, it went into our methamphetamine. It's just saturated our drug supply.
Hey, quick timeout. If you made it this far in the video, then you must like it at least a little bit. If that's the case and you want to see more, then please like and subscribe, and I'll keep bringing you this content. And it helps YouTube figure out that people actually like this, and they'll send people this way, and we'll grow. With your help, I really appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah. So heroin's more of a boutique item at this point, right? But it sounds like with the extra work and everything, and
Yeah.
it sounds like less income ultimately.
Yeah, which, if it's drug trafficker, that's it's all about money, right? It's interesting. It's funny. One of the things I also look at is I look what's cut into drugs, right? Like if you have a pound product, a raw 100% heroin, you're never going to distribute that. It's too strong. Plus, from a drug trafficker perspective, if I cut it with something, now I might have 2 pounds, right? So I make more money. So I always look at the cutting agents and the adulterants and things like that. And I found a list of cutting agents in fentanyl, and one of them was listed as heroin. And it blew me away because 10 years ago, it was the other way around, right? Heroin's the product and it's being cut with fentanyl. And now fentanyl's the product's being cut with heroin. I mean, it's just, again, we've totally reversed it.
So besides the fentanyl situation, are there any other drugs that are going on right now that are a problem?
You know, the news picks and chooses what it wants to talk about. I mean, nitazines have been hitting the news quite a bit. Or all these synthetic opioids out in the market. Yeah, there's tons of them. To me, it all comes back to fentanyl, right? And in fact, all these drugs are all being compared to fentanyl. There's a new drug on the market, and it's 20 times more dangerous than fentanyl, but we're not seeing, I mean, we're seeing them, and they're certainly a concern, but fentanyl is the game changer. It's the one that's had the biggest impact. When you look at, like I said, you look at the overall drug deaths, the drug poisonings, and you can contribute 70 to 75% of those deaths to the one drug. That's the main concern. Yeah, we're always looking at the other threats. Another threat I'll tell you is we're actually seeing an increase in cocaine and methamphetamine use. I believe, and I have some evidence behind this, it's because of our pharmaceutical industry and our push of stimulants to younger people over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And now we've over prescribed stimulants to young people.
Yeah,
And now we have young
Adderall,
adults.
right?
Adderall, everything, you name it. And in fact, if you look at what's going on, it literally parallels what happened in the 1990s. Big Pharma, Purdue, they pushed the opioids out like it was water. They told us it was non-addictive, and then we got a rise in heroin, right? And if you look over the last, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years, and there's data that support this isn't just my opinion, you see the number of stimulants to young people. I mean, it just took off. Well, what do you think a lot of these folks turn to when they don't feel like they're getting enough, or mom and dad tell them they don't need it anymore? Cocaine and amphetamine, psychostimulants. We're already seeing an increase in use for young people on both those drugs. And more tragically, we're already seeing an increase in deaths because of those two drugs in younger people. So that's the one I'm more concerned about than some of those boutique drugs, like the nitazines. Again, they're a concern. I'm watching them, but traffickers, they know how to adapt. And
Whew, okay, this is so
kind of,
uplifting.
kind of a downer. We need to pick it up.
All right, well, hell, let's talk about raves. Raves are cool.
Oh, great.
You, so you had some sort of
Oops.
investigation with raves. Why don't you just tell us about that?
Yeah, that was actually a fun investigation, and I was newer at the time with DEA. We had some folks who were hosting rave parties, and they were using drug proceeds to do this. And then at the rave parties, they would either sell drugs or they would allow others to sell drugs, and they would profit off that as well. And it got just huge. I mean, they were bringing in 20, 30,000, 40,000 people. I mean, these rave parties where you hear about them on the news, the big warehouses that are just absolutely. I mean, they were even doing it legally. They were renting large venues and just filling it up with people. $20 a person coming in, and the artists they brought in. I mean, Paul Confold. I can't remember all the names right now, but just well-known artists within the rave community, and just paying them with drug proceeds. And it was a neat case. It was we had a lot of meth cases, a lot of coke cases, a few weed cases here and there, the bigger ones. And this was a pill case, and it's not as sexy. And quite frankly, there's a lot of folks in law enforcement. This was in the early 2000s who were like, it's pills. The stigma is a little different. But they impact people and they're illegal. And I remember I had a 17-year-old who went to one of these parties and he died. And so it's concerning. And started working this investigation, and actually started going into the rave parties working undercover. We were wearing cameras, and I'd go in and I'd have baggy jeans on, and I looked a lot younger. And I'd put my baseball hat on backwards and act like a college kid who's just, put a pacifier in my mouth. And
So I've never been to a rave, but I thought it was mostly psychedelics like MDMA and what.
we Well, XCMDMA for sure. That's what our primary drug was. They were also doing a lot of LSD and GHB as well. So yeah, those are drugs that we primarily see in that party scene to this day in some of the bars and things like that. 100%. Moving a lot. My break was actually. Oh, this was great. I had a main target who. We'd put him in the system, and we have deconfliction ways we can deconflict, right? And the Miami, Florida office had just popped a guy with a couple thousand pills or something like that. It wasn't huge, but it was enough to get DA's attention. And they run the guy's name and his telephone number and all the information they had, and boom, the system starts lighting up, and it's like, hey, Townsend and I was actually in Arkansas at the time, has an investigation on this guy. So the investigator called me and says, "Hey, I got this guy. He you know, just got popped, and he's cooperating." And so that evening I was on a flight to Miami and sitting across the table from him, interviewing him. And I mean, he just gave me a ton of information, really, really spelled out how the operation was moving, the dope. And My interest was obviously my main target in Arkansas. Um, but then, I mean, he just expanded it further. I mean, the drugs were coming in from France, and they were getting flown in to Miami, and then there was some Cubans involved, and the Cubans would mule them or transport them to various cities, Jackson, Mississippi, Atlanta, Georgia, Little Rock, Arkansas, just along the South corridor there. And one of them happened to be my target in Little Rock, Arkansas. So that was great. We were able to utilize his cooperation and some information that he provided us to do some investigative things on our end, and then almost like the wire, the case we talked about with Baltimore, it was the same thing. Now I was kind of wrapping it up. I was putting other co-conspirators, the boring part, I was the interviews, the getting all the data and the information and collaborating records, which is absolutely important, and I was happy to do it.
It sounds like interviews would be kind of fun. I don't know. Do you ever do like the good cop, bad cop, or?
I don't know that we actually. I one time in my career, my partner and I tried that, and it was an absolute failure. And we kind of laughed when we left the room. We're like, "All right, that's a bad idea. We're not going to do that again." Um, Sometimes we're both good cops. Sometimes we're both bad cop. Really, just you had to, had to had to kind of match the energy that the person. But I love interviewing. Love, love, love. I love sitting in front of people and getting information out of them, because the one thing at DEA was much different was we're not looking for an admission of guilt. Now, don't be wrong. It's nice if I'm sitting across from you and you tell me that, yeah, I did it. You got me and blah, blah, blah. By the time I interviewed, I had you. I felt confident. I mean, the U.S. attorney felt confident. I mean, we all felt confident that we had a federal prosecutable case. So yes, if you admit to it, that's just makes the hearings a little shorter and a little quicker, right? But ultimately, I'm looking for the cooperation, and who are your sources, who are your main customers, who's what are you doing with the money, who's transporting this stuff, who are you calling, you know what I mean, like just every single facet of the organization. That's more I'm interested in. I mean, again, getting the confession's great, but I want to take this case to another level.
Right. Yeah. If he's just a local drug dealer, then, well, fantastic. If he says he did it, okay, great. Sure, fantastic. But what about, what about your boss? Et cetera, et
Exactly.
cetera.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
really what DEA should be doing. Is we're always supposed to keep on going to the next level, right? Trying to get the biggest, most violent people out there, and sometimes we're successful, and sometimes we're not. But absolutely, that has to be the goal in mind.
So when you were going to the raves, was that the goal? So the goal was to get the big picture, not this kid who just did some MDMA standing over.
Absolutely. And and some of that just physically going was also just intel, right? I mean, I'd never been into a rave. I needed to know what was going on inside. I'd hear things. We had cooperators, people talking, but we needed to physically see these things. And people say it's an open air drug market. There's drug sales everywhere. Okay, let's physically see that, with our own eyes. And that's exactly what we saw. I mean, literally, I mean, I can tell you people, they were drug traffickers, and they would just have lines of people just standing in line. This wasn't behind the building. And they would just, when their time's up, they'd pull their cash out and they'd get drugs and walk away. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I mean, it was just,
Wow.
um, yeah, I actually stood in one of those lines and bought some dope. So
So you get up to the front of the line and they say, this is what we have for sale. And you choose from what they had, which was
literally, th-
LSD, Molly,
yeah,
and maybe, and then the pills.
yeah. And usually they would have, like I remember one line I stood in he had aluminum foil with LSD in it. And that was all he had. He was an LSD guy. And the majority of them were just ecstasy, MDMA, and you knew it when you got up there or when you were in line, and they'd ask you
Was
how many you
so
wanted.
you'd say, is this the line for the ecstasy?
It's
And
as
yeah,
silly as it
no, that's the
sounds.
line over there.
I'm telling you, it sounds crazy, but that's pretty much what it was. I mean, it was blew my mind away. I got to tell you, I was like, how is this even possible? Like, am I in the twilight zone right now? Like, what is going on right now?
So on a local police level, I mean, how is it that they don't just go break it up before it even gets going? Or is there a turning the cheek? Like what?
No,
Tell us.
no, they started bringing in law enforcement. They actually had their own private security, and those guys were all just, I mean, they were, drug traffickers, hiring their buddies, so they would turn the cheek. And then when they got bigger and they started to try to legitimize their operations by renting actual like large venues, there was requirements. If you go rent a convention center, you might have to, per contract, you might have to have, X amount of police officers or law enforcement and pay them at this rate and blah blah blah. And that's what they end up doing. They end up getting so big, so they would be more careful, obviously, as time went on and they got bigger. They'd be a little bit more discreet about the drug trafficking and stuff like that. But quite frankly, when you got 25,000 kids, running around in the dark and the lights are flashing and the strobes and everything else, I mean, these cops they're at the door, they're watching them, $20, or actually 20, I'd say 20 was the low end, sometimes 40, $50 to get in these parties. There's a lot of cash, so primarily that's what your security is doing, right? Making sure that someone doesn't come in and rob that cash. They're not to say that they would turn a blind eye, but that's not really what they were there for. And that would be a difficult, I mean, you'd have to physically go in and kind of walk these were large venues. These were, like I said, convention center type venues.
So, Brian, why don't you just wrap us up in a bow for us and give us your final thoughts?
When you watch the movies, it's always, you see the surveillance, you see the bus, you see the arrests. And yeah, that's obviously a adrenaline, dump there, and it's fun as well. But I got to tell you, just interviewing people, and when they would give me information and I would have to collaborate the information, there's a lot of, people might say it's boring, a lot of desk work, but it's very important. And when you can put 30, 40 people in jail, because of that, that's rewarding as well, because those are people that are a danger to society. And you know so it's not always as sexy, but it's important.
And so then if people want to enjoy some of your content, I know you have a website. What do you have that people can take a look at?
Yeah, so I have two primarily. Eagle Six Training is www.eagle, EAGLE, and then just the number six, and then training, TRAINING, yeah, .com. And that's my private business. We train, consult, teach. In fact, I actually have a presentation where I talk about an undercover operation that I did, and it was featured on a A&E show called Undercover Caught on Tape. And I tell that story, but I tell it from a leadership perspective, being prepared, resilience, just, different leadership principles. So I try not just to tell a war story. I try to make it applicable to leadership. So I do that. And of course we do other training, consulting. If someone's interested in learning more about fentanyl or other public safety threats, I would ask them to go to only2mg.com. So ONLY and then the number two and then mg.com. And that's a nonprofit organization. We raise awareness, like I said, of illicit fentanyl primarily, but other public safety threats as well. We do those presentations for free. If an organization can afford to bring us in, then that's great. We'll use that money to cover travel when an organization can't bring us in, right? So one pays for the other, if you will. And we're not doing this to get rich. We're doing this to raise awareness. And there's three presentations. The main one I've done 130, 140 times now across the United States. And there's another one I really like. I call it Shattering Dreams. It's where I talk to young people. It's ideally an hour, but there are some times when I get into schools and they're like, we can't give you an hour. We can give you 20 minutes. I'll take it. I'll amend the presentation to whatever time I can get, but ideally it's an hour. And the goal there is to empower kids with information. So when they're in these difficult positions, they make better choices.
All right, Brian. Well, I appreciate you coming back on. I'll make sure to put all those websites in the show notes so that people have them. And it was fun again. I love your stories.
Hey, thank you, Shane. I appreciate you and your time. And yeah, thanks for having me back on.
You bet.